Welcome back to the Let's Buy a Home podcast. I'm your host, first-time buyer mortgage advisor Dan Knott, and today we are talking all things shared ownership. I'm joined by Nick from Share to Buy. Nick,
Hiya.
welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Dan.
Please do introduce yourself and also Share to Buy.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm Nick Lieb. I'm the Chief Operation Officer at Share to Buy. Share to Buy is a property portal. So for those that don't know what a property portal is, that's what a Rightmove is, that's what a Zoopla is. But for our property portal, we specifically cater for first-time buyers and people that need a little bit of help to get onto the property ladder.
Amazing. Well, Nick, we start every podcast with the same question, okay? The Let's Buy a Home Hall of Fame is a place where each of our guests place an item that they absolutely could not live without. It could be furniture, decor, a tool, a toy, or a gadget. So, Nick, what would you like to place into the Hall of Fame?
Well, I'm a cat owner, so it has to be a lint roller. Otherwise, I'd be here now with cat hair all over me. So yeah, lint roller, essential for cat owners out there.
Good answer, and it's the first time I've had that one,
I thought
so
it might be, yeah.
I like it, I like it. Perfect. Okay, well, as our listeners may be able to hear, me and Nick are actually both from Sunderland. That's where we both call home. That's a rarity on the Let's Buy Home podcast. Might be the only time this happens. So yeah, thank you for joining me. What is the mission of Share to Buy?
So the mission's always been the same, really, which is to empower people into understanding more about what their home ownership options are. We're a nation obsessed with home ownership and buying a property, but as years have gone on, it's just got harder and harder for people to do that, and the entry points have got harder and harder for the average person to be able to do it. So our website really started off as a vehicle to educate on shared ownership, a particular affordable home ownership scheme. But as time's gone on, that's grown to basically any type of help towards getting on the ladder, incentive schemes, saving schemes, other affordable home ownership schemes, even private sales stuff. You can find information and homes about that on our website.
How did Share to Buy get started, and what gap in the market was it hoping to fill?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the very, very abridged version. So it actually started life 20 odd years ago as a mortgage broker. And if you speak to the directors, they'll tell you it was the first online only mortgage broker. And at the time, they had a deal with one of the building societies, which was a mortgage product aimed at graduates that wanted to buy together. So this is pre-credit crunch, when there was all sorts of wild and wonderful mortgage deals out there. And with this one, you could have up to 4 graduates on the same mortgage. And because of that, the name they used to sell that product was Share to Buy. So the company existed as a mortgage broker, but because of the name, lots and lots of people were getting in touch asking questions about the shared ownership scheme. And so around about 2011, 2012, the directors decided to invest and pivot away from just being a mortgage broker into providing a website about shared ownership. And from there, the property portal kind of grew out of that.
Amazing. That's great to see.
And we're not a mortgage broker anymore. So that part of the business ended, and we just focus on the property and education side now.
Perfect. Well, let's get into the meat of the podcast. What are the biggest challenges you see first-time buyers facing today?
I mean, in one word, it's affordability, really. No matter how you kind of skin it, really, it's affordability. It's always been a challenge. You know, if you go back and speak to your granny, speak to anybody, they'll tell you, oh, it was never easy to buy a home, and that's true. But I think it's never been harder to buy a home either. And that's because private rental costs are so high, cost of living's really high. Unless you're fortunate enough to have help from your parents, the bank of mum and dad, or to be able to live somewhere where you can live rent-free, or to be, one of the few people out there that have got a wage which is high enough to be able to save for a deposit, it's really, really tricky to get onto the property ladder. In prep for this, I looked at a few stats. The average first-time buyer property that was sold in 2024 in the UK was 311,000 with a deposit of 60,000. In London, it was 511,000 with a deposit of around about 124,000. So if you're thinking, let's do the numbers on that, to just try and save up that much money each month is really, really tricky. And that's why it's becoming harder and harder for people to get on the ladder.
It is. I think, it can be as simple as in London, the average house price is being reported as being around about 13 times the average salary. Quite simply, that means that borrowing 4.5 times your income isn't going to cut it for a lot of people, or the average person. From my experience working with home buyers on a day-to-day basis, something I always say is people, in my experience, come to me more so looking for higher levels of borrowing, such as borrowing up to 6 times their income, more so than they have struggles with deposit. So that's something, I see every day.
Yeah, interesting. See, our side of it is more so the deposit.
Hmm.
side of it. And that's the customers that we tend to deal with, or the people who would visit our website. So they're in employment. The actual monthly cost of
Hmm.
paying a mortgage they can afford in most cases.
Hmm.
What they can't afford is saving up for the deposit, which is where these affordable schemes generally tend to come in, is to reduce that entry point of being able to get on the ladder.
Let's dive into those schemes then.
Sure.
What is shared ownership?
So shared ownership is the biggest and oldest of the affordable home ownership schemes, and it's existed, depending on who you speak to. 1979, 1980 was the first shared ownership scheme. And to try and boil it down very simply, what it means by shared ownership is you buy a share of the property and you have a mortgage for that share. And the amount that you don't own, the amount that you haven't bought or haven't mortgaged, you pay rent on it. And typically that rent is to a housing association. So on a monthly basis, you might be paying a bit towards the mortgage, a bit towards the rent for the bit that you haven't purchased. And if you're in a property that's in a flat, then probably a service charge as well.
What's the biggest misconception around shared ownership?
There's loads. Where do you start? I would say the probably the one that you encounter the most, which is understandable given its name, is that you're just sharing with a random stranger and you've got no say over who you're sharing with. You're not sharing with anybody else. The people who live in your house, it's down to you. You're sharing with, or you've bought a share, and essentially you're sharing the lease with the housing association that you bought the property from. You can, over time, build up your shares to go all the way to 100%, so you can eventually own the property outright.
I think it's all about removing hurdles, isn't it?
Mm.
Who is shared ownership suitable for?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because when it was initially created, it was very specifically for young families and it was for key workers.
Mhm.
As time's gone on, and with time, the housing crisis, let's call it, in this country, has got worse, and it's got harder and harder for people to, um, well, or the cost of their housing each month has got higher and higher. Shared ownership's kind of been expanded way out now, so it's for anybody that is earning in London less than a household income of £90,000, and in the rest of the country less than a household income less than £80,000. You must be a first-time buyer, and by that I mean you must not currently own a property. So if you are in a property that you own and you're interested in shared ownership, you would need to be able to show that that property is going to be sold before you can complete the transaction. But yeah, generally, a short answer to that is it's just for anybody who is looking to get on the property ladder but can't do it via the traditional route. They can't. They've looked on Rightmove, they've looked on Zoopla, and they've seen that they need £80,000 in the bank to be able to do it, or even half that, £40,000. These are massive amounts of money, which in today's climate is very difficult to save for.
Mm.
So shared ownership is an option for people who are in that situation, really.
Yeah, something I always say, because I'm often asked the question, Dan, is this suitable for me? Should I use shared ownership? Something I say, and you can tell me whether you agree or not, is that it's there for people who need it. It's not a cheat code to
Mm.
owning a property. It's there for people who are in a position where maybe the traditional route isn't going to be suitable for them.
Yeah.
Now, due to circumstances, the amount of people who need this sort of purchase is growing.
Mm.
But yeah, to me, it's there for people who need it, and unfortunately, that may be becoming a higher and higher amount of
Yeah.
people.
I mean, you're exactly right. And when I first started, um, shared ownership was very much a London and South East thing. There was shared ownership all over the country,
Mhm.
but the amount of it was a lot less than it is now because it wasn't needed as much. Where me and you were from, Sunderland, the deposit to get on the housing ladder a few years ago would have been kind of achievable if you were
Mhm.
in full-time employment, really. You might have to save for a few years, but it was achievable. As years have gone on, and particularly since COVID and costs have gone way up for everybody, just getting to that point of being able to put down a deposit for a property has got more and more difficult. So really, shared ownership is now a national product,
Mhm.
and it's helping families and individuals and couples all over the country now.
Mhm.
I did it. That's how I got started on the ladder when I was living in London, and I would not have been able to buy a property in London. Even now, I wouldn't have been able
Mhm.
to do it if I'd kept saving, or the sort of property that would have been suitable for me anyway. I lived in shared ownership property for 7 years, made a bit of money out of it, sold it, and I've now bought a property back up north where the house prices are lower.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's important though to something I always say is not everybody lives in London.
Mm,
The house price situation where we're from, Sunderland, is much different to London. It can still be difficult buying a
mm.
home up in the northeast, but it is very much a different landscape to London.
And where you see shared ownership applied, really, I'm speaking in quite general terms, but in London it's a lot of 1 and 2 bedroom properties. There are some 3 bedroom, there are some 4 bedroom properties out there, but they're like gold dust really. The rest of the country, shared ownership's more of a family sized
Mhm.
property scheme, and suits families better because uh, the cost of buying a family sized property is where it might push somebody out of that deposit
Mhm.
range. But again, that is changing. Places like Manchester, places like Bristol, the big cities, Cambridge, they're so expensive again to live within that shared ownership is becoming more and more prevalent in those areas too.
And if somebody's listening to this podcast and thinking, you know what, maybe I'm not going to be able to go down the traditional route, maybe I do need a housing option or a purchase option just like this, where can they begin to look for shared ownership options?
So I'll plug my own website here if you don't mind. Yeah, sharetobuy.com. So we are a website that lists the vast majority of shared ownership properties around the country. We also list some of the other smaller affordable home ownership schemes. There's schemes like Rent to Buy, London Living Rent, Discount Market Sale, Discount Full Ownership. There's lots and lots of schemes. There's just nothing that quite has the number of properties available as shared ownership does at the moment.
Mhm.
So our website, as well as having the properties that are available, we've got loads and loads of guides on there, tools, affordability calculators. We've tried to create somewhere that is specifically for people that need that extra level of
Mhm.
help.
And how does the process differ for somebody buying a shared ownership property that's a new build or buying a shared ownership property that's being resold?
Well, uh, this might sound an obvious answer, but if you're buying a new build, you'll be the first person to
Mhm.
live in that property. Whereas if you're buying a resale, you're buying it off somebody else who's lived in there as a shared owner as well. So you'll be typically buying the size of the share that they had purchased up to that point. New build properties, there is what's called a bit of a new build premium. So new build properties, that's not a shared ownership thing. That kind of applies to anything new build really. There's often I don't know how it's calculated, but there is a premium for buying new build, which means it's slightly more expensive than if you were to find a similar property that was a resale property. But yeah, in terms of the actual process, there isn't a huge amount of difference other than if you're buying a new build, there's no chain. If you're buying a resale property, typically there's going to be a chain because you're buying it off somebody
Mhm.
who's already lived in it.
Yeah, but you do have to purchase the share amount of the person who's selling the
Yeah, I
property.
mean, it can differ. You can negotiate with the housing provider. It might be that you can buy a higher share. Typically, you can't buy a lower share than they might have
Mhm.
purchased. So I had mine. I bought it as a 50% share, and I sold it at a 50% share. As I say, I could have potentially negotiated to buy it and have a higher share, but I don't think I would have been able to buy it at a lower share. But it's always worth asking the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Let's do some shared ownership fact or fiction.
Hit me.
Okay. A quick pause. If you're a first time buyer, you don't need to figure this all out on your own. I'm Dan Knott, also known as Dan Does Mortgages, and I work with first time buyers around the UK, helping them to achieve mortgage success and to take their first steps onto the ladder. If you want to know what you can borrow, what deposit size you need, and what your monthly payments are going to look like, let's have a chat. Book your free mortgage appointment right now via the link in the show notes. Back to the episode. You need a huge deposit for shared ownership.
Fiction, the opposite, really. Huge is a subjective word, of course, right? So there are some shared ownership properties where you still need a 20 grand, 30 grand deposit, but that's probably buying a high value property with a high share. But generally speaking, the deposit that you need would be a lot less than if you were buying the equivalent property as a 100% ownership property.
Shared ownership is always more expensive than renting.
Again, fiction. You have got to weigh it up. Really, there's no hard and fast rule whether it is or it isn't. But what I would say is that if you're in shared ownership, some of that money that you're putting into the property is your money that is going to come back to you at some point. If you're paying rent, fully rent, all your money's going to your landlord essentially.
You don't actually own your home with shared ownership.
So this gets into the sort of semantics of leasehold, I would say a little bit, and maybe if you haven't already, get a leasehold expert on one day for one of these podcasts because that's itself is a huge discussion point and is changing as well around laws around leasehold. If you live in a shared ownership property, you can eventually staircase up to 100% in most cases if you can afford it, and it'll be judged on what your finances are at that time and what the value of the property is at that time. Up until that point, you're a leaseholder. If you're in a shared ownership home, a house, I should say, and you staircase all the way to 100%, buying more shares is called staircasing. If you staircase all the way to 100%, generally you'll be able to get the freehold of that property if it's a house. If it's a flat in a block, it'll probably remain leasehold, but that is the same as if it wasn't a shared ownership property and you were buying a flat in a block.
Yeah, it's important to remember as well that there are many properties that aren't shared ownership at all, which are leasehold.
Yeah.
It's not just a shared ownership
No,
issue,
no,
that one.
exactly. And actually, a lot of the or some of the issues that are sort of flagged up about shared ownership are often leasehold issues,
Mhm.
and the two kind of get conflated together a lot of the
Mhm.
time. Leasehold is a sort of British quirk. Let's put it that way. It doesn't exist the same way in some other countries. There's even talk about phasing leasehold out with common law. Or common hold, I think it's called. Again, get somebody else who's an expert on to talk about leasehold. But it does come with particular rules that all people who are buying a leasehold property should be aware of up front.
Mhm.
And you will have a lease that you should look at, the solicitor should look at, stick it into ChatGPT, ask it to look at it, and ask some questions of that. These are all important things that you need to be aware of when you're buying.
Perfect. You can't decorate your home the way you want.
Uh, Again, fiction. Although I would say it depends what the way you want includes. If you want to be knocking out walls and you're living in a flat, probably not. If you want to, change the outside of the building, again, you're going to have to sort of run this through the housing association. But generally speaking, on the indoor side of things, if you want to paint a room, if you want to stick some wallpaper up, you want to put some flooring down, you want to rip out the kitchen, put a new one in, these are all things you can do. It's just important to keep your housing association or the housing provider that you're sharing the property with up to date with what changes you are making.
You lose money when the property value goes up because you only own a share.
No, it's the opposite of that. So the same way as if your property goes up in value or down in value, if you're buying the traditional route, that applies to shared ownership. So again, I'll just use a simple example. If you had a 100% share, your share was worth £100,000, and it went up by 10% and was now worth £110,000, then you're going to benefit from that. And if it goes down, then again, you're going to suffer from that. Now, generally speaking, and without having a crystal ball, property prices in the UK have gone up and up and up over years. So generally speaking, most people will have made money out of their property if they've stayed in it long enough.
Shared ownership homes are harder to sell.
Yeah, I understand why this one exists as a question. I wouldn't necessarily say harder, it's just a different process. So shared ownership properties are partially built with money from the government. And because of that, there's a few rules that apply to them. They're not easy to get shared ownership properties. There's not a huge amount of or an endless number of them. So if possible, when a shared ownership property is being sold, generally speaking, the housing provider would like to keep that as a shared ownership property. So they will ask for a nomination period. It'll be in your lease. You'll be aware of this up front. That might be 4 weeks. It might be 8 weeks. And within that 4 to 8 weeks, it gives the housing association the opportunity to try and find another buyer to buy it as a shared ownership property. If they can't in that time, then you're welcome to then go and see a local estate agent and try and sell it that way. But yeah, the reason why that exists, the nomination period as it's called exists, is to try and protect it as a shared ownership property. If it's sold by the open market, it might go for 100%, and then it's lost as a shared ownership property.
You have to staircase in huge jumps, like 50% at a time.
Yeah, that's not correct. You can staircase from 1% a year for newer shared ownership properties. Typically, we wouldn't advise anybody to staircase in chunks any lower than like 10%, and that's just because there's a few costs involved every time you do staircase. So you have to get the property valued again. There might be some solicitor costs. You might have to pay a broker again. So it's worth being aware that there are some costs associated with staircasing, and if you're going to do it, it makes sense to try and do it in bigger chunks. You can do 1% staircasing, like I mentioned, and there's very little costs involved in that. Again, you'd need to speak to your housing provider about that side of things.
This needs to be your first ever home to qualify.
No. So I touched on that a little bit earlier as well. You can have been a homeowner in the past. You can even be a homeowner at the time that you start searching for properties and start applying for properties. But that property needs to be in the process of selling, and you must have sold that property by the time you can take on a new shared ownership property.
Shared ownership is an amazing opportunity for the right home buyer.
Well, yeah, I'd say yes to that, but I'd also say that it's not the right thing for everybody as well. So it's important to bear that in mind. It's an option, and I think over the past few years, because Help to Buy is gone, and shared ownership's kind of seen as the only option, then people feel a little bit like they're being forced down one particular route. But it is only an option, and people have to assess and speak to financial advisors, and sit down and really work out what your plans are for the next few years, what your ambitions are with owning a property or buying a property via shared ownership, to determine whether it's right for you. It might be that actually you can stay with your mum and dad for another couple of years, and then actually you'll be able to afford to buy on the outright market. Now that's a decision for you, how much you can put up with living with your parents, or they can put up with living with you for a couple of years. But it's not just as simple as, this is the only thing you can do. There are always options out there, and it's worth
Mhm.
doing your research and speaking to some experts, checking out podcasts like yours, Dan, to see what other options are available.
And if somebody has listened to this so far and they think, you know what, I do want to look at shared ownership options, what's that process from pulling up your website to then potentially reserving a property?
Yeah, so again, there are other sources out there where you might be able to find shared ownership properties, but let's say you go on by the share to buy route, you'll see the property that you like on our website, and then you'll send an inquiry. You can do that over the phone, or you can just do it by clicking a couple of buttons on the website, and that'll send your details across to the housing provider or the sales agent. Typically, they'll contact you. It slightly differs in process between different providers. Some providers would like you to, at that point, speak to one of their approved financial advisors and go through a financial assessment just to check that you are eligible for shared ownership and to try and determine what share is the right share for you to purchase. If you pass that, then they'll arrange for you to go down and view the property if it's available for you to view. Other providers might let you come down and view the property first and then go through the assessment. So it's the same process, just flipped a little bit. If it's the property for you, then you can make a formal application and put down a reservation fee. And then after that, it's very similar to the process if you were buying a property otherwise, which is that it'll then go to the solicitors, they'll do their bit. The housing association solicitors will also do their bit. It really, it's a bit of a fool's errand really to try and say it'll take 6 weeks or it'll take 8 weeks. It can take, various different amounts of time really, but I think probably the quickest I've ever heard of is about 4 weeks. The longest I've ever heard of is probably like 3 or 4 months
Mhm.
really, which again is very typical to buying a property otherwise as well.
Yeah, I think it's important for our listeners to know as well that when you are looking to buy, whether it's through a standard purchase or through a scheme like shared ownership, you also do need to establish your mortgage options, and what those options look like. You know, not every lender on the market will accept shared ownership. There are plenty that do, but not all of them will. But we do need to meet shared ownership affordability with the lenders. And yeah, definitely look to have that conversation as well. Maybe before you are going and viewing properties and falling in love and redesigning the kitchen.
Hmm.
Understand where you stand with shared ownership, where you stand with a standard purchase too. And yeah, run the figures with an
Hmm.
expert before you do fall in love and
Yeah.
work out exactly what's possible.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, who I would say shared ownership works really well for, um, or a typical person it would work really well for is you're living in private rent, and it's expensive and it's doing your head in. Um, the last place I privately rented was in southeast London, and my time in London went from zone two, zone three,
Mm.
zone four. By the end, I was living in zone six. I was getting pushed further and further out of where I really wanted to be. And my rent was going up and up and up every year, and I wasn't getting a better experience with that
Mhm.
with that cost. So the penultimate place I lived, we got evicted, for no particular reason, just they wanted to move their mate in instead with pretty short notice. The next place which was the most expensive place that we were at, and the last place, thankfully, we had a neighbour that lived downstairs and stole my pizza one day from a delivery, and we were just kind of at the end of our tether with renting. Really, we were spending so much money on it, um, and none of it was coming back to us. And we turned 30. We were getting to the point where we were like, well, do we stay in London? And we started looking at properties outside of London. But this is pre-COVID. Remote working wasn't really a thing. I needed to be in London for my job, um, and ultimately, the thing that worked for us and meant that we could live in somewhere that we wanted to live, in an area of London that we had previously lived in, and we'd kind of been forced out with rental prices. Shared ownership allowed us to do that. We had a really good experience with shared ownership. Um, there are other people that their experience has been a bit mixed. you're probably aware, since Grenfell, there's cladding issues, fire safety issues that have affected lots and lots of properties, particularly in London. Again, they aren't always that's not necessarily a shared ownership thing, but shared owners can get caught up in that as well. So I would always just say, it's an option. Do your research. There's tens of thousands of people that have had positive experiences with shared ownership. I think at the last count that I saw, there's probably around about 250,000 people in the UK now living in shared ownership properties. It has helped tens of thousands of people have a little bit more security in their housing situation.
Yeah, and I think absolutely, if you are considering that, get educated, understand your position, understand shared ownership, the pros and the cons,
Yeah,
and then you can make an informed decision. Is this something you want to do?
yeah,
Do you want to wait and try and make a standard purchase, or is this the right
yeah,
move right now? And if it is, you're ready to go, you're proceedable, and if the right home pops up,
yeah.
yeah, you're in a great position to do so.
Do your research, and in that research, you'll find people who say it's great, and you'll find some people who have not had a great experience with it. And read both and assess both. And with those people who have not had a great experience, understand why. And if you are still interested in shared ownership, ask those questions to the people that are trying to sell you the properties. There's a real push for transparency. There's a real push for explaining the pros and the cons, like you mentioned. This is an affordable home ownership scheme built with a bit of government money. So there are some compromises that you'll need to make if you want to go down the shared ownership route. But I would say the compromises aren't so great that it should put anybody off, really. It's just about assessing each individual situation.
Absolutely. So if you are interested, do check that out. Are there any other similar schemes that are there to remove hurdles and hopefully
Yeah.
help people on the ladder?
There are, yeah. And interestingly, since Help to Buy ended, which is a couple of years ago now, there's been little private-led schemes as well. Some of the house builders that would typically have delivered Help to Buy properties have introduced their own incentive schemes to try and help first-time buyers as well. The government schemes that are out there in any sort of volume, and there's not huge numbers of some of the schemes, but you've got shared ownership, you've got first homes, you've got discount market sale, you've got one that's called discount full ownership, which is a version of discount market sale. You've got intermediate rent, rent to buy, London living rent. And I can already say, and looking at your face, like already that's like a lot of jargon, a lot of words, and people might be watching this thinking, bloody hell, where do I even get started? Which again is why we created the website to try and explain what these different schemes are and how they might be able to help you. At the moment, there isn't anything that's in the same volume as shared ownership in terms of the availability of it. Some of the private-led schemes that have come in recent years, Deposit Unlock, which again is something that reduces the initial deposit that you need to put down. There's Save to Buy, which is a Fairview scheme. There is a new one called Reside, which is by Persimmon and Barratt Homes, which is a version of Help to Buy, really. Obviously just financed differently, not by the government, via the house builders. And there's the own new rate reducer as well, which is an interesting incentive whereby you're buying a property at 100%, but you might be able to get a reduced rate on your mortgage for the first fixed term of that mortgage. So there's plenty out there. And there's I'm constantly being contacted by small private companies that are trying out new affordable schemes. So yeah, it's just about, again, assessing what's out there, seeing, okay, that sounds like a great scheme. Are there actually any properties out there in the region that I want to live in? And yeah, it's not easy. That's why you're doing your thing. That's why we're doing our thing. We have events like the London Home Show. We do smaller roadshow where we try and meet buyers in person to explain what's going on. As I say, it's a bit, it's not easy out there for buyers, but there are people trying to help and there are options out there.
I wasn't much of a fan of Help to Buy, but I'll tell you why. I thought it was a better scheme in an area like where we're from, in the northeast, where homes are a little bit more affordable. I thought it was quite a risky scheme for buyers in London, where house prices are so huge and people were potentially getting a 40% equity loan. And when it came to the end of that interest-free period, it was very difficult for some people to make up that 40%. That's something I experienced firsthand with people contacting me looking for advice. And yeah, I wasn't too keen on it, to be honest, as a London-based scheme.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's quite a political one, I would say. There's certainly critics of it and certainly advocates of it. I know the house builders like it.
Hmm.
Certainly helps them sort of move things along and keep the market going. What I would say, with the rights and wrongs of the scheme, they're to be debated. What I would say is that it did help a cohort of buyers that at the moment are probably a little bit underserved.
Hmm.
So, in an ideal world, we don't need any of these things, right? There's no housing crisis.
Hmm.
Property values are in line with wages and, all of these things that have happened over the last few decades. There's not as much need for. But the reality of where we are now is it's very hard for modest incomes to get on the housing ladder. But increasingly, it's even harder for, plus £90,000 household income to get on the housing ladder. Help to Buy came in because it didn't have that income cap.
Hmm.
So you've got your share ownership buyers, and then you would have your Help to Buy buyers, and there was a bit of overlap between the two. But generally speaking, they were different
Hmm.
audiences. So yeah, as I said, the rights and wrongs or the exactly how Help to Buy was the components of it are there to be debated. But it did help a particular cohort of buyers, and at the moment, since Help to Buy went, and the expectation I think was that something would come along to replace it, and that hasn't happened. And the budget was last week, and there wasn't really anything else that in there around that either. So yeah, as I say, tricky for buyers.
Yeah, it was. I say a great scheme. In certain areas, in my opinion, I've got a friend who used the scheme, worked perfectly,
Yeah.
did exactly what it was meant to do for him. So yeah, absolutely, there was a lot of success that came out of it. You did mention other options, such as the discount market value properties. I actually bought my first home using that exact scheme, and I'm a big fan of it.
Yeah.
I really think it should be more available.
Are you still in that property, or have you sold it?
Moved,
Yeah.
but it worked really well.
Yeah.
So we bought that home in 2019. It was a new build property based in the northeast. We got a 30% discount off the purchase price. At that time, we had one income. I was relatively newly self-employed. We needed that scheme. It was time for us to get our own house. We couldn't afford a full value property. We bought that house. We knew that we wanted to start a family at some point in the near future, so we wanted a nice house in a nice area. We bought a 2-bedroom new build house in a lovely estate. It allowed us to do that. We wouldn't have been able to do that otherwise. Now, when it comes to selling the property, the so to speak negative would be that you have to sell it at the same 30% discount. Therefore, you're not going to fully benefit from 100% of the appreciation in value. However, we did benefit from the 70% that we had.
Yeah.
And what we found was we sold during a time where the market was a little bit down, homes weren't selling very well. We had 25 viewings in the first across 2 days. We had 11 offers at asking price.
Wow. Yeah.
And we sold it straight away,
Yeah.
and it was fantastic. And the reason for that was, in my opinion, there's always going to be young people who want to buy a nice property at an affordable rate
Sure.
in a nice place.
Yeah.
And it worked. It was a really, really fantastic scheme for
Yeah.
us. I can't speak about it highly enough.
Yeah.
As long as you have the
Interesting.
pros and the cons,
Yeah.
yeah, it worked really well for
Yeah.
us.
And that's just it. I mean, look, you had a 30%. You benefited from a 30% discount, right? But that property only exists so you can do that again for the next buyer, right? So it's interesting. I mean, look, there are countries out there in Europe where homeownership's not as big a thing, and they have a really high quality private rental. And my brother lives in Denmark, and those Scandinavian utopias, they're a real thing. They have totally different ways of doing things. But this country isn't, set up like that. Buying a home or having a stake in a home is really can be transformational for people. I know it made a massive difference for my life, going from rental and moving I think the longest time I stayed in somewhere in the private renting between the age of 18 and how old was I when I bought? Probably like late 30s, was 18 months. A lot of movement in that time. I was in my shared ownership place for 7 years. And it just makes a massive difference. So that's whether it's shared ownership you're doing it, the traditional route, discount market sale like you've done, whatever it is, there's just something about having somewhere you can put down some roots that makes a difference to your life, I reckon.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that it doesn't necessarily need to be forever. If you do choose to buy one of these properties and that is going to be your home forever, fantastic.
Yeah.
But you can choose to move as well. As we say, our first home, we needed that scheme. We now own a bigger property. We own it outright. Reason being, circumstances change. You earn more income,
Yeah.
and your options can improve. But at that time, that was it was the perfect option for us.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd echo that with shared ownership with me. As I say, there's other people that might have tried discount market sale and it's not been as good for them, or shared ownership is not big enough for them. It's just about assessing what's out there and understanding what you're getting into before you get into it, I would say. There's the cons that people say, they're compromises, they're the realities of the scheme, I would say. So, ask questions, speak to experts. That's always my advice. Ask questions, speak to experts, read the lease. If there's something that you don't understand, ask your solicitor or ask the person that's trying to sell it to you. Nobody's going to tell you off for asking questions. And if they do, then they're probably not a reliable person to buy off.
Exactly. There's no such thing as a silly question.
Yeah.
What do you think needs to be done in the UK so that home ownership remains an achievable goal?
Wow. That's a big question, probably for bigger brains than mine as well. I think we just need more of this. If unless house prices come down and substantially, and with that comes massive economic issues. If house prices were to suddenly drop down to more affordable levels across the board, but it is for the governments to continue to back these affordable schemes, and keep trying to improve the private rented side of things as well. I'm reading a good book at the minute, Dan, called Homesick: How Housing Broke London, by a guy called Peter Rapps, which is all about the particular London housing market and how that's changed over the years, and how certain decisions by successive governments have meant that we're in the situation now where there's lots of people in temporary accommodation, there's lots of people in homes of multiple occupancy. It makes quite sad reading, really. And I know the current government are saying they're going to really back social housing, and I hope they do. Building is important. We need a choice in this country. We need really good quality social. We need really good quality private rented. We need really good quality shared ownership. We need really good quality intermediate options, and then we need the private market to do the private market side of things. So the maths behind all that and how you make that happen is for the politicians. But yeah, look, I just think that housing's got to be a priority for governments, and it hasn't been, I think, in maybe recent years. Labour say they're going to build 1.5 million homes. Good luck. I hope they do.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk, and a term we hear thrown about is fix the housing market. Something I always say to people, what is that?
Yeah.
Because in reality, house prices across the country are not going to half.
No.
Okay, so
And if they did, we'd all be in trouble.
exactly. So what does that mean? So to me, that means managing the increase in somewhat in line with wages. But I think it's never going to be a perfect time to buy a property, unfortunately. I agree. I feel like these schemes need to become more available, especially for me, the market discount scheme. That needs to become more available. If it does, I think it's going to be a good option for the right people. But yeah, if you're in a position you want to buy a home and you're not sure whether it's going to happen, as you've mentioned, and I reiterate, speak to an expert, understand your position early, make a plan, and then work towards it.
Yeah.
It is achievable. That's how me and you are in a job.
Sure.
So, the amount of TikTok comments I've had that state nobody can buy a home anymore. It's not the case, because that's how we're in a job. It can be done. It's difficult, but with an expert on your side and a good plan, yeah, there's means to make it happen.
Yeah, there is. And also just as people to, you mentioned the perfect time to buy a home, and we get asked that a lot as well. Should we do it now or should we wait? Should we do it now? Should we wait? Everybody's situation is different. And it's really about assessing, like, is your current circumstances something that you can live with, you're happy enough with? If not, see what options are out there. And it might be that there's something that you can save towards. It'll take a year, a couple of years, but at least you've got a plan. If your current situation's fine and you're happy enough, then don't feel like you're forced to buy a property either. Everybody's situation is different, really, and that might be a bit of a sort of sitting on the fence thing to say, but it's true. Everybody's got to make the right decision for what's the best for their circumstances.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that answer. That was a great answer. Is there anything exciting coming up with Share to Buy that we need to know about?
Well, we have a sub brand called Share to Buy Live, which is about our live events. We've hosted an event called the London Home Show funnily enough, in London, twice a year since the year 2013. And what we try and do with that event is make the website come to life. So we'll have all the housing providers there. We'll have solicitors there, brokers there. Dan, you're very welcome to come on to the next one. We have talks. It's really trying to educate people in person, because as much as everything's great online these days, people like to speak to people in person. They like to ask their questions the way they like to ask them. So we're expanding that. We've got events coming up in Exeter, Manchester, Bristol next year, as well as London, and more to be confirmed. So I would just say check out sharetobuy.com, and all the information will be on there.
Absolutely. So do check that out. We finish every podcast with the same question. What does home mean to you?
Yeah, I've been asked this question before as well, and actually I think it's no pun intended. It's the foundations, really. I think you just need to speak to people who are not in a secure home to see the impact that has on their lives. And me being in one property for 7 years, as I was towards the end of time in London, made a total difference, because I could plan for the future, and I knew what was going to be happening in 12 months' time, in 24 months' time. I knew what my mortgage rate was going to be, because I had a fixed term. You know, all of these things really make a difference. It's that foundation that allows you to grow the rest of your life, I would say, is home.
I'm going to extend that question for you, just because you're from Sunderland and this may not happen again. How does the idea of home fit into not just the house, but also a region or an area?
Yeah, well, it's true that there's only one home, really, which is my mum and dad's in Sunderland. And that always feels, I still say it, I'm going home for the weekend, or I'm going to see mum and dad at home. And it's part of your identity, I think, as well. But other people would say differently. You know, I suppose we're lucky to come from somewhere like Sunderland, I think. And maybe at other times in my life I wouldn't have said that, but having seen enough of the world and what else is out there, yeah, there's no place like home. There's no place like Sunderland. Should we end it on that?
We'll end it on that. Well, thank you very much, Nick, for
Thank you.
appearing on the podcast. That was fantastic. Listeners, thank you for joining us once again, and we'll be back next week with another episode.